Okay, welcome to the video lecture for Music History 1, Chapter 9 from the Ground History of Western Music, Franco-Flemish composers from 1450 to 1520, in other words, the first half of the Renaissance. Now, Franco-Flemish, Franco means French. Someone who's said to be a Francophile is a fan of French art, French culture, French literature, etc. Flemish, that is the lowlands, Belgium, that area in there. This is one of the most important regions in musical composition during the Renaissance. As a matter of fact, this area exported, kind of building on the work of the Burgundians, or continuing the work of the Burgundians, exported composers all over Europe. So, we talked about Guillaume Dufay in the last video lecture. The next very important composers we'll run into are Jean de Ockeghem and Antoine Busnois. Now, Ockeghem did not write a ton of music, but he was very highly thought of. He worked for over 40 years for the kings of France, so his output was centered almost entirely in France, obviously. He was very much renowned for his masses, and we're going to break one of his masses apart extensively in class. 13 masses, a Requiem Mass, in other words, from the Roman Catholic Mass for the Dead, motets and 21 chansons, French songs. Contrast this slightly with his contemporary, Antoine Busnois, who, Busnois, I've heard it pronounced both ways. He was best known, actually, primarily for his secular music, for his chanson. Now, unlike Ockeghem, who served the kings of France, Busnois actually was in Burgundy, and the Habsburg Empire, which was basically the Holy Roman Empire in Austria and Hungary. So he did not stay in the area. He kind of moved east a little bit. His music was very tonal. It was tonally conceived, and his cadences are actually a little more clear than some of the music we hear coming before. You can kind of hear the triadic structure of his music. Remember, we talked about in the Renaissance, composers begin to conceive of things more vertically, the concept of stacking the voices so that we have resulting consonances, triads, and his music is an excellent example of that. Both of these composers are great examples of this transition between the older style of music and the counterpoint that really the 15th century becomes known for. His music, both their music, but Busnois specifically, his chansons were very popular, were published all over Europe. Many different countries would publish his chanson. Remember, this after they mentioned the printing press now, so music publishing is a common thing. So we're going to look at their music and take this as an opportunity to kind of figure out where the Mass has been going. Remember, before 1420, the only composer who ever set a complete Mass ordinary was Machaut. Starting in 1420, it actually becomes a much more common thing to do. As a matter of fact, most composers who are composing sacred music set at least one Mass ordinary. Many of them set quite a few Mass ordinaries. So, we've seen how the music's developing. First of all, we've now gone almost entirely to the four-voice texture that we were starting to switch to. We discussed in Chapter 8. And the range. The voice ranges expand. Somewhat higher, but quite a bit lower, we'll discover. So if we look at the Dufay Mass, we'll see that the Superius goes from a B to an E, a range of an octave and a fourth, whereas Ockeghem's Mass, that we're going to discuss in some detail, actually adds a third to the lower range and a step to the upper range, giving us almost a two full octave range in his Superius. The other voices are the same. They expand both on the lower end of things and for the most part, on the higher end of things as well. That's something we can really say happens throughout music, though, is music continuously becomes more challenging. For the most part, the composers think of new ways to challenge musicians. The musicians rise to the occasion, and what was hard a generation ago becomes a little more commonplace until the next composer comes along to make it even more difficult. The expansion of range is, of course, one of those examples. Now, Ockegham's most famous mass is Missa Parlationum. If you think of prolation symbols that we talked about, basically modern time signatures, it was really, this is a remarkable achievement. We're going to spend some time in class breaking this down. What he basically did was he wrote 2 lines of music, but each line of music was in 2 different meters. One voice would sing the top line in 1 meter, and then another voice would sing the top line in the different meter, giving us effectively 2 completely different lines of music rhythmically being drawn from the same notation. So he notated 2 voices, but 4 people sing it because each voice sings in its own meter, its own rhythm, essentially. The superiorist and the alto, the top 2 lines, sing the same line of music but in different meters. Tenor and bass sing a different line of music, but they're in different meters, giving us 4 voices. I'll break this down in class. We don't actually need to look at this, but the result of it is, with these 2 lines of music, is the superiorist in 2/4, the altus in 3/4, the tenor in 9/8, and the bass in 6/8. It's really quite remarkable that he even conceived of composing music like this. Now, in addition to the fact that this that he utilizes these different mensuration signs, prolation symbols, it's a canon. Now, a canon is essentially, the most famous canon is probably Pachelbel's canon in D from the Baroque era, but a canon is essentially imitative polyphony. When you have 1 line of music, and by having 2 people start it at different times, you effectively wind up with 2 lines of music. Canon is from the Latin word rule, and as I said, it comes from, you can get 2 or more voices from a single line of music simply by delaying the entrances. You can delay them, you can also invert. If you want to get more complicated, you can invert the voices. For example, if the opening interval is a ascending perfect fifth, then you can have the second voice sing a descending perfect fifth, or retrograde, singing backwards. This really all comes to a head in the music of Bach, by the way, when he started writing fugues with this level of complexity. So this is a mensuration canon, meaning 2 voices singing the mensuration canon, meaning 2 voices sing the same part, same line of music using different durations, but it's also a double canon, meaning there are 2 canons happening simultaneously. Very complex to conceive of. Performing it, maybe not as difficult as it sounds like it would be, as long as everyone does what they're supposed to, but we will absolutely break this apart in class. So, after Ockeghem and Busnois, we get the next triumvirate, if you will, of great Franco-Flemish composers. They were all born at approximately the same time and were contemporaries of each other. Obrecht, Jacob Obrecht, Heinrich Isaac, and Josquin de Prez. Now, all famous and important in their own time. All of them born and trained in the Low Countries, Flemish area, present-day Belgium, areas like that. They all traveled throughout Europe, absorbing different styles, becoming part of this international style that we talk about. They also became best known for being in different areas. For example, Isaac's probably best known for the work he did in Germany, a lot of it. Generally, what these composers did is they structured their vocal music based on the structure of the text. They didn't try and cram the text into specific musical forms. Instead, they let the text dictate what musical form they would use. All of their lines were singable. It was important to them that the lines be easily singable. Each voice was treated equally, It's all stuff that we kind of teased in Chapter 7 when we were setting up what was going to happen in the Renaissance moving forward. The 4-voice texture had become standard in all of their music, and sometimes they went to 5 and even 6 voices, and the textures they used were imitative counterpoint and imitative polyphony and homophonic texture. Frequently they would alternate these two textures within a piece. Obrecht, 30 cantus firmus masses. If you remember in Chapter 8 we talked about the different kind of mass cycles you could write. 28 motets, many secular chansons, songs in Dutch, where he's from, and instrumental music as well. We're now beginning to see for the first time in the Renaissance, and we'll get into this more later in the chapter, or later in the unit, people beginning to write instrumental music specifically for instruments, not just playing vocal music on instruments. Isaac worked in Italy for the De Medici family, one of the most famous and important families in history, in all of European history. The Medicis ruled areas of Italy for centuries, and also worked for the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in Austria, where I think probably his most famous works came from. Wrote 35 masses, 50 motets, a cycle of musical settings for the mass proper, for the entire church year, mostly church year, secular songs in French, Italian, and German. Again, that international travel, absorbing international styles, enabling him to compose in vernacular in a variety of countries. Also, he published some works that did not have any text at all, so we assume these were probably instrumental works. He's best known, I think, for his songs in homophonic texture. We're going to listen to an example. Songs in German. The German word for song is Lied. Now, in classical music, when you hear the word Lied, you know it's German for song, and we usually think of art song of the early Romantic era, or of the Romantic era in general. German Lied, plural is Lieder, songs by Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, Hugo Wolf, composers of that ilk. But actually, it simply is the German word for song. So, Isaac's songs for multiple voices were called Lied, and they were primarily in a homophonic texture, which became an important part of the style. We're going to listen to Innsbruck, I Must Leave You, and we're actually going to, it's pretty cool because it becomes an incredibly important song a little bit later, but not with these words. That's what we call foreshadowing, or teasing. That brings us to Josquin de Prez. Josquin is absolutely the most important composer of his time, hands down. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first composers, maybe the first composer, whose music was attributed to him and continued to be performed long after he died. Most composers, once they died, their music kind of died with them until, in many cases, it was resurrected centuries later by people who were researching music of that era and liked it. So, Josquin was very influential. Many composers copied him. His works, well, he wrote 18 masses that, at least, we know he wrote 18 masses, we have the music for them, over 50 motets, 65 chansons, and 10 instrument. 10 of these, we think, were untexted instrumental works. He didn't break a lot of new ground with his influences and his style. His texts, sacred texts, primarily drawn from the Mass proper, other sacred sources. He composed the music freely, composed every voice, did not utilize pre-existing chant for a tenor voice, for a cantus firmus. He used imitative polyphony, occasionally monophony, and you'll find homophonic textures in his music as well. Careful declamation of text. He wanted the text to be clearly understood, so the way he wrote, the text was not obscured, and he also was a master of word painting that we will get into. Text depiction is when, or also known as word painting, is when the music attempts to represent what the word means. Text expression is when the music attempts to reflect the emotions behind the music. Now we're going to listen and break down the score in class, of Ave Maria Virgo Serena, which is a motet. And to me, it's one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written. It absolutely kills me every time I hear it. And it's a great example of text expression, of how he uses the music to kind of emphasize the emotions that the text is suggesting. But we will get into that in class. Josquin's masses. Most of them are, or many of them are cantus firmus masses, but like many composers of the time, he liked to use a secular song as his cantus instead of using a pre-existing Gregorian chant. He wrote cantus firmus masses, he wrote imitation masses, he also wrote paraphrase masses, all stuff that we talked about in chapter 8. His chansons, his secular songs, strophic, frequently he would use strophic texts, meaning setting the same music to every verse. Fixed forms are gone. They are totally obsolete. He wasn't really using them. Wrote in 4-voice texture, sometimes 5-voice texture. Every voice was treated equally. Again, since we're not using a cantus firmus, or since we're not using a pre-existing chant, every voice is composed freely and is equally important. And all of his chansons employ imitative polyphony and homophonic texture. And we will listen to one of Josquin's chansons, composed approximately 1520, so about halfway, a little more than halfway through the Renaissance, depending on whose dates you're using. So, all of these composers, Ockeghem, Buznoi, Obrecht, Isaac, and Josquin, all very well known during their life and also after their death. Josquin, his music, of course, continued to be performed after his death before it was lost and eventually resurrected. All of the rest of them, for the most part, their music was lost, and we've just been performing it now for the last 100 to 200 years. As I said, Ockeghem's music was lost primarily. Josquin's music continued and was influential for much longer. Works cited by theorists and written histories of music. We're going to get to that once we start talking about the 1700s. Sir Charles Burney's History of Western Music, the first ever comprehensive music history book, actually talked about Josquin. Okay, that is chapter 9. There is an online quiz for chapter 9 that you will have to take, and you will obviously need this video lecture to complete it.